The developments are fast-moving, they're complicated, and I thought this was a good opportunity to try to sort things out and get a clear sense as possible of what the political landscape is today in Brazil. 6 months ago, the president Rousseff was impeached. President Temer has low approval levels. The Lava Jato investigation proceeds with no end in sight, at least in the short term. And the economy is, in some respects, picking up, but still is facing profound, deep-seated challenges. And that requires getting things through Congress, which is, of course, very, very difficult. So we thought it would be good to talk about all of this, where we are and where things are going. And, of course, the 2018 elections next year, presidential elections, are already part of the environment, political environment in Brazil, and need to be taken into account as well. So we're going to have a conversation about that, and we're delighted to have three superb speakers to share their thoughts and perspectives about where we are, and then we're going to open it up to all of you for a good conversation. Claudia Trevisan is a journalist, a correspondent here in Washington for Estado São Paulo. Before that, she was in China for some years. She's a good friend of the dialogue. She's participated in a lot of events, and she follows developments and situation in Brazil very closely, and we're thrilled to have her back with us again. João Augusto de Castro Neves is the director of the Latin American group at Eurasia Group. João has a doctorate in international relations from the University of São Paulo. He is often quoted in comments in the press and about Brazilian politics, economics, foreign policy, and we're thrilled to have him with us at the dialogue once again. The font on his name is a little bit smaller because he has a longer name than everybody else. So nobody should misinterpret the fact that the font size on his name.
I'll bring my own next time.
Yours is the biggest one.
Well, let's not get let's save that for later, Barbara. Finally, we have Peter Haycom, who's a senior fellow and president emeritus at the Dialogue, who follows Brazil very, very closely, writes a column for Folha, occasionally, Folha São Paulo, and is a Brazil file since he went there in, 1969 or something. So Peter always has interesting, provocative things to say. So we'll hear brief remarks from three of our speakers, and then we'll invite your comments and reactions and have a good discussion. Start with Claudia. Claudia, thank you.
Thank you. Good morning for all. I'll try to speak a little bit more about economy, which is obviously will have a great impact on the 2018 election, and I'm sure João will speak in a much more alternative way about politics in Brazil. We say in Brazil that the year starts after Carnival, which means that the first day of 2017 will be on Wednesday. And the last year of the previous years in this calendar was last week, and it brought some positive news for the government on the economic front, and also a reminder that the Lava Jato is still the main source of political and economic uncertainty in Brazil. In the economic front, the inflation is going down, and it will probably end 2017 below the 4.5% target that is established by the central bank. This reduction in inflation opens space for the central bank to start a reduction in interest rates, and most economists now think that the Selic, our benchmark rate, will be below 10% by the year end. Now it's 12.25%. Foreign direct investment reached a record high in January, above all expectations, and it reached the highest level for a January in 22 years. The stock exchange reached its highest level in 6 years. The real gained value against the dollar, and industrial production increased in December in the comparison with November. On Wednesday, Minister of Finance, Henrique Meirelles, declared the end of the deepest and longest recession of Brazil history. There is no official number of GDP growth yet to support his claim, but he points to these recent numbers to say that the economy is growing again. The problem for the government is that these first signs of reaction have not been translated yet in real changes for most of Brazilians. Unemployment rate reached a record high in January of 12.6%, which means that almost 30 million Brazilians are still without a job. And when this post-carnival year starts, the government will be in a race against time to translate these economic benefits in real changes for most of Brazilians. But most economists think that this will be a very slow process, which might affect the Temer's ability to influence the result of the 2018 election. Most of the economists think the recovery in employment will start only by the end of 2017 or early 2018. The government believes the economy this year will grow by 1% after a contraction that was more than 4% last year. But most of the private projections point to an expansion of 0.5%, which is hardly an impressive number. What the economists say is that there is no clear engine of growth, since they don't expect reaction in consumption, in investment, or public expenditure. Both families and corporations in Brazil have a very high level of debt, which limits their ability to consume and invest. And of course, the government is in a terrible fiscal situation, which also limits its ability to spend. And even this low economic expectation is precarious and dependent on the political scenario, especially the approval of the pension reform. If the government fails on this front, it will affect confidence of economic actors and generate economic turbulence. And without the pension reform, it will be very hard on the long run to enforce the expenditure ceiling that was approved in 2016, and that so far is the main victory of the reformist agenda of the government. And last week, we saw bad news for government in the political front, with the Lava Jato getting closer to Temer and threatening his chief of staff, Eliseu Padilha, who is the main person in charge of negotiating the pension reform with Congress. And the situation of jobs and wages will obviously be crucial for the 2018 election. If there is no significant improvement, it will probably benefit Lula, the former president, Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva, who is leading all opinion polls, and it's on the rise instead of in decline. We cannot forget that Lula left the presidency with an approval rate of over 8%, and that many Brazilians have a very positive economic memory of his government. By contrast, most Brazilians don't believe Temer governed for them. A Datafolha poll that was released in December showed that 75% of the people that were interviewed believed Temer defends the rich. Only 7% said that he defends the poor. Lula is being investigated in many fronts of the Lava Jato operation, and it's not clear that he will manage to be a candidate or not. But many other Brazilian politicians are also being investigated, which kind of neutralizes the accusations against Lula. Now, if everybody's corrupt, at least I will vote for somebody that had a benefit effect on my life. And the polls are showing a reduction on his rejection. His rejection is by far the largest one, and it reached 5-7% at the beginning of last year, but then it reduced. The most recent number from Datafolha is from mid-2016, and it had fallen for 46%. And the most recent presidential poll made by the Confederação Nacional dos Transportes showed that Lula, the only candidate that gained in the popular intention vote, was Lula and the right-wing candidate Jair Bolsonaro. All candidates, all over, fell. Marina da Silva, Aécio Neves, Geraldo Alckmin, and Lula and Bolsonaro, they saw an increase in their numbers, both against Lava Jato, that are being organized by people that are more sympathetic to the government. They say the protest is not a protest against the government, but for Lava Jato. But we never know how the streets will react. So it's one more source of uncertainty.
Great. Thank you very much, Claudia. That was terrific. Joel?
Yeah. Thank you, Michael. Pleasure to be here, as always. This new offices here at the Dialogue. As Claudia mentioned, there are a lot of dark clouds in the horizon when you look at Brazil's economy, when you look at Brazil's politics, and those clouds are likely to remain. Talking earlier with Peter, we've been saying how there's been a lot of volatility in Brazil of late. Well, not so late, of last couple of years. Exactly. The first message here is that volatility will continue, right? When you go and when you talk to investors that are looking at Brazil watchers, when you go down to Brazil, it's funny that every time I go, you can kind of measure, now people are optimistic and now they're pessimistic, and you go back and forth. Try to look beneath or beyond that haze. I mean, we do see some more sustainable trends there that I'm going to mention, but overall, in the short term, I think that there will be more, despite some incipient signs of economic recovery, despite belief that Temer will survive to the end of his term next year, I think that there are still some bumps in the road that will happen over the course of the next few months, starting with, Claudia mentioned already, the protests are expected to happen, and with the backdrop of unemployment, of course, that feeds into that discontent. Even if it's not directly aimed at the government, it does there's a confluence of dissatisfaction across the board that you may have a trigger that it may lead to something bigger. There's the corruption scandal itself, Lava Jato, that it's the gift that keeps on giving in Brazilian politics for the last 3 years. And there's a lot of information there that will continue to leak, find its way to the press, to headlines, and generate some headaches for the government. There is a case against the president as well, against the presidential ticket in the electoral court that's going to come out, that will come out soon, likely to ask for the invalidation of the president of the Rousseff Temer ticket. We don't think that will be confirmed by the full court, but still it's something that's going to generate a lot of noise in the coming months. So you look at how markets, how investors are looking in Brazil right now. It's very bipolar, right? So there's some good numbers when you look at the markets, stock exchange, the currency, et cetera, and the Brazil risk, the spreads, and all of that. But when you look at the real economy, it doesn't. There's still no reflection of that positive dynamic. So you look at unemployment, GDP still pretty weak. But that up and down will continue to happen. So what does that mean when you look at Brazil now into 2018 and going forward? I think taking a step back and trying to put the volatility aside, I think that there are two underlying transformative cycles happening in Brazil. The first one is the structural reforms that we've been seeing. that the inflection point was not necessarily this government, the Temer government, that began, right, with the microeconomic reforms, macro reforms, fiscal reforms. It actually began with Rousseff 2.0 after re-election. Of course, in a very haphazard way, discreet, she did appoint a new finance minister that was not in line with the belief of her party. It was Joaquim Levy, but that was a tacit way to recognize that change was needed, that she couldn't continue that recipe of fiscal expansion, government intervening in several sectors of the economy. So there's a sense there that she needed to implement a course correction. She appointed a finance minister who believed that as well, but she didn't give him full support. So I think but that's kind of the beginning of the inflection point, where that model of growth that worked for Brazil for quite some time with Lula, commodity boom, and then Rousseff early on, that model reached an exhaustion point. So you have the inflection point that began with Joaquim Levy and Dilma Rousseff in 2015, and that was a course correction move driven mainly by necessity, whereas we have now government that replaced her government that has kind of the same recipe, but driven out of conviction, not out of necessity, and doubling down on these reforms. And the list goes on. If you look at the macro fiscal reforms, the spending cap that Claudia referred to, pension reform, trying to put the fiscal house in order, and also a laundry list of microeconomic reforms in the oil sector, infrastructure, mining, so on and so forth, essentially trying to reduce the role of the state in a lot of these sectors. So this is the first transformative cycle, very similar to what Brazil went through in the 1990s, so some would say, right? But some would even argue that even potentially more ambitious as well. And the second transformative cycle underneath it all is the Lava Jato itself, the corruption investigations, right? That began 3 years ago. These Lava Jato writ large, because now Lava Jato is a corruption scandal that began around Petrobras and the dealings of Petrobras with companies, with the large conglomerates in Brazil that do business with the oil sector as well. But now you have offshoots of Lava Jato that essentially reached the core of Brazil's capitalist model, which is basically these large construction companies, BNDES, the state-owned companies. Essentially, it's Brazil's capitalist model. So you've had that happening, this kind of cleansing, so to speak, of trying to shed some light into the relations between public and private sectors in Brazil, decision makers across the board. And it's a bumpy process. While the reform cycle is deliberate, it's planned, it's led by government, this one is not. It's, someone would say, sometimes even chaotic, with excesses as well. Some would argue that Brazil's judiciary, legal institutions are strong. Yes, they are. They have autonomy. They're strong. This is part of the reason why this is happening in Brazil and not in other countries in Latin America. And you do have corruption in these other countries, but there's something to say about the strength of Brazil's legal institutions. But you have to recognize that there may be some excesses as well, some problems there. But if you look longer term, it is nonetheless a positive process, a positive cycle of redrawing the relationship between public and private sectors in Brazil, improving corporate governance, increasing transparency, raising the cost of corruption, right? I think politicians will have to become more creative to be corrupt, and well, they eventually will, unfortunately, but that's the sad reality of it. But it is a positive process nonetheless, with some near-term costs, right? Decision makers in Brazil, in the private sector, in the public sector, they're not willing to make decisions now because they don't want to sign any papers, right? Because there's a hyperactivity of the courts, of the accounting tribunal, the TCU, and other courts that you want their green light in order to invest on anything. That may partially explain why it's taking long for the economy to recover, because some investments are not happening as fast as you'd like. But down the road, you do see more transparency, stricter compliance rules and due diligence and transparency, et cetera. So I think it's a positive. So these two cycles put together, they do intertwine to some extent. And of course, the messier the Lava Jato cycle is, it may undermine the reform cycle as well, given the fact that you may have important ministers of the government being fired, or even the president himself having to step down, and that may slow down the reform cycle. But we do think that these two transformative cycles, they will continue to unfold over the next in the coming years, and it's overall positive for Brazil, which leads to my final point: 2018 election. What will the 2018 election say about these two cycles? Will they continue or won't they continue? I think that it's too soon to make a prediction yet of who's going to win the election, right? So sometimes you don't even know who won the last election. Here in the U.S., for example, there's still the controversy, right? Apparently, but I think that the two features of the next election in Brazil that we have to look out for is the two features are: one, fragmentation. It tends to have the election is likely to have more candidates. Far from that polarization that we've seen over the last 2 decades between the PT and the PSDB. So fragmentation, of course, more candidates, it means a more competitive landscape. And there are many, many names out there that we've been seeing from left to right: Lula, Bolsonaro, and everywhere in between. The second feature is, but interestingly enough, when you look at the recent polls that came out showing Lula and Bolsonaro as kind of the two, Lula left wing, Bolsonaro a right wing candidate, is that, who's going to win? I think that the election will be less about left and right and more about political or apolitical or anti-establishment, right? I mean, there was definitely a kind of shift to the right in the municipal elections last year in Brazil, but I think it had less to do with ideology and more to do with the fact that it was the left that was in power during this major crisis. So the PT paid a price not for its ideology. It paid a price because it presided the country during the worst crisis in history. In fact, if you take the PT out of the picture and you look at the performance of other left-wing parties in Brazil, they weren't that bad. It's kind of stable. So the political and policy pendulum in Brazil is moving away from the left towards the right. Yes, but it may be a less consistent move than we think. So that I would flag that as a concern here. But to end and trying to do a little bit of predicting here, and for 2018, even though it's not going to be a left-right divide, I think a more anti-political outsider versus mainstream traditional politician. I do think that what does that mean in terms of who's going to win, or what kind of policy views that person will have? It may be, extreme views left or right. Yes, but then if you look at the main driver of the election next year in Brazil, as in many, many places in the world, is this popular discontent with the political class, period. Here in the US, Trump. In UK, Brexit. In France, Le Pen. In Brazil, etc. So you have this popular discontent, the wind of discontent blowing across the world, and manifesting itself in the politics in the elections, and giving these surprise elections for many. But I think there's something to say, even though there's a common denominator there, which is the discontent, middle class discontent towards their political class, the establishment is not responding to their demands. I think that there is a slight difference to point out particularly between the developed world and the developing world, or if you will, the U.S. and Brazil in that sense. Here in the U.S., it was a declining middle class, Rust Belt, blue-collar workers that were becoming increasingly disgruntled with the government, right? And the fact that the decline in their lifestyle and their way of life led to this feeling of almost xenophobia and fear from what comes from the outside, protectionism, nationalism. In Brazil, it's not a declining middle class that is content. It is a rising middle class. This is the story till 2013-14. Of course, now there's been some slight decline there in recent 2 years, but still, it's a much more story of a rising middle class that wants more from their government, and their government is not delivering. And that does not necessarily translate into nationalism, into protectionism, into xenophobia. Quite the contrary. It may actually lead to more efficient policies, potentially, that today are more identified with the right in Brazil than with the left. So that will end with there, which is kind of to provoke some discussions.
Great. Well, if you're going to provoke, nobody better than Peter Hickam to provoke. Peter, you optimistic?
let me say, I can see a great deal of agreement on this panel.
Up until now.
I think that, I had down the three things, the essential drivers that are coming, and basically they're the same ones that we've just heard. Where the economy is going, what's going to happen in the Lava Jato investigations and the implications for the government, and how the 2018 election is going to shape up. And I think that at the end, you added one, the popular discontent, which I think that could be more important than we think. When it first emerged in 2013, everyone was surprised. All of a sudden, you have millions of people on the streets. Dilma's popularity sort of plunges very quickly. And I think we shouldn't underestimate that possibility emerging again if the economy takes another slide downward, if the Lava Jato sort of reveals something that I'm not quite sure what that would be, but there is that possibility. And why that's important, there's a fourth, I think, is that Temer has shown a certain agility, a certain degree of skill in managing the bureaucracy, in managing the legislative segment, in other words, moving bills through, getting people appointed that he wanted appointed, balancing the various parties, etc., and sort of avoiding sort of conflicts within the group of close to 400 people in the House supporting him. But if there is a sort of a reemergence of any kind of popular protest, discontent and all, that is probably something that he and the current government can't manage very well. They don't have much outreach. So I think that that's an important just element that sits in the background. And I can't help but thinking and sort of reflecting on what I've heard is what a friend of mine who's a political analyst in Brazil back in 1980 sort of said that, Brazil is not a normal country. And, I can't help but see that again today and what he said was, in a normal country, we know what's going to happen in the next week, in the next months, and maybe in the next couple of years. We have some sense of it. And we, as time goes on, though, it becomes more and more blurry, more and more cloudy. In Brazil, the tendency is we don't know what's going to happen in the next 6 months. We don't know what's going to happen in the next election. But the long run, you emphasize this, things look bright. So we don't know what's going to happen in the short run, but we're making predictions about the longer run. And that's what he said was less than normal, if you like, strange, that Brazil tends to go through these cycles. In any event, I don't think I have a whole lot to add on the economy. I think there are reasons for believing that there has been some improvement. And one, frankly, is that the Minister of Finance is still in place, is still highly regarded. He still seems to be in a position where he is sort of shaping policy, if not exactly what he wants. He's in a very good, it's created a certain degree of optimism in the business community among investors. I'm not sure that the rebound is all that encouraging. Brazil suffered a terrible, large setback over 2 years. About 7-8% of the economy was wiped out. And so one has to expect some kind of bounce after that kind of loss. And the question is whether that will continue. And that's what we have now is more confidence building stage. Let me just, the Lava Jato, this government has already lost 8 ministers to corruption. lost 9 with Jose Serra this week because of presumably a back problem. But, imagine losing, 1/3 of your ministers, in 6 months. And a number of others are under the spotlight. The Lava Jato investigation is about to really grow much larger as the information, the testimony of Odebrecht, Marcelo Odebrecht, is going to be soon become very, very public. I mean, it's leaking out and all over the place, but it could become very much bigger, and there's going to be a whole lot of whether in the long run everyone has to congratulate and praise and pay tribute to the Brazilian judiciary. I think you're right. There's nowhere else in Latin America, perhaps except for Chile maybe, have you had this kind of anti-corruption response where actually people in top positions in business and government are being charged, being arrested, prosecuted, put in jail. Nowhere else. And the press has played such a superb role in uncovering a lot of this. On the same time, remember that back in 2005, there was the Mensalão corruption scandal, which the government was paying for votes in Congress. Well, a dozen years has gone by, and we still haven't seen, despite all the judicial effect, the fact of party leaders and political leaders going to jail. The corruption is continuing, and you have more than half of Congress still being investigated. And Congress keeps trying at different points, unsuccessfully so far, to sort of block further openings, to try and sort of modify the rules of investigation, the rules of enforcement. So, I mean, this is still a cat and mouse game as far as the and just lastly, I think the election is way up in the air. I mean, it's just so hard. I mean, you said Lula's leading in all the polls. He gets something like 16%.
No, if you ask for the electorate to say a name without presenting the name, if you present a list, he has more than 30%.
Okay, let's say 30%. No, that wasn't about. But my point is simply, first of all, he's facing 5 different charges now. Could go on trial anytime between now and the election. I gather that some political analysts, you could tell me this better than I can, João, that there isn't enough time to actually bring him to trial and get him convicted, that he's likely to be eligible for the presidency in the next election. But the question is how much information comes out in the press on what he's accused of, what the evidence is, which will be a big factor in determining whether he's a viable candidate or not. So far, there's really no other viable candidate. You mentioned the right. This is a man that makes Donald Trump look like a Democrat, and he just seems very unlikely. So it probably will be João, somebody who is very much unknown. One can pick 2 or 3 people that look like they may be enough unknown to still win. But I think that's the big uncertainty right now. And what happens when the political cycle starts, which it starts in 4 or 5 months from now, July, August of this year, you're going to begin to see. And what happens then is just unknown. So we really are in a position where things are cloudy, and cloudy in 2 ways. They're cloudy in the sense that there is lots of bad news as well as some good news, and cloudy in some sense that you can't see what's beyond the clouds, that things are clouded.
Thanks, Peter. Cloudy was the key word there.
Cloudy.
Claudia or cloudy?
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you all for those great comments. we don't have a lot of time, but what I like to do is just collect a bunch of questions and comments, and then turn it back to the panel. But there are a lot of issues out there, and just please tell us who you are and try to be brief, and that'd be great. We'll start with Gabriel. You don't need a microphone. We have
Okay.
it. So please, okay.
As
Gabriel,
Gabriel
please.
Trebot, sorry, Director.
I know everybody knows you.
With
but-
Party Associates.
Yeah.
So President Temer, as Claudia mentioned, has record low approval ratings. Lava Jato's getting closer to him. He's lost 8 or 9 ministers. Yet he's been able to pass some really historic, far-reaching reforms. How do we explain that situation? And what do you think is the outlook for pension and labor reform, which I think are still pending?
Great. Thank you. Jim?
Sort of builds on that one, which is
Just James, give me.
James Gibney from Bloomberg View. You talked about the transformative effects of these different reforms and how they're really challenging the core of Brazil's capitalist model. My question is, to what extent has the public's perception of the safety net and whether or not it can be maintained really changed? You have these very generous social benefits that have been enshrined in the Constitution, and I'm just curious as to, that seems like another area that needs some transformation.
Great. Barbara.
Back to the economy and.
Barbara Stallings,
Oh, sorry.
please.
Barbara. Back to the economy and Claudia in particular. We all know that Chinese trade and investment was crucial in the upswing. I'm curious as to whether Chinese trade and investment is now helping in the sort of green shoots that you talked about in your presentation.
Michael.
Get to the
Please
wider,
identify.
Mike Macetti, PBS Online News Hour, get to some of the wider regional implications. I was just in Mexico and all the talk was, well, if we're having trouble with Trump, et cetera, we're going to hook up with Brazil and Argentina, and there's going to be all this Latin American solidarity, so on and so forth. That may be jumping into a leaky boat? But also the construction company, I can't pronounce the name correctly, scandal, is seeping all through Latin America. It's not just Brazilian corruption, they're nailing people all around. And finally, Peter, I cannot resist your description of a normal country would seem to apply to the United States. We don't know what's going to happen tomorrow, but we're optimistic about the future.
You are.
No, most Americans are still optimistic.
Tomorrow, middle of cabinet at noon. Yeah, and then we'll go to the back.
Okay.
Yeah,
TJ Conway, Energy Intelligence. Tied to the question of Odebrecht, I'm just wondering your views on what the future of sort of the construction sector is, and the relationship with the government and the leniency deals, because it's such a fundamental part of the economy in the future.
Yes, please.
Yes, my name is Fidel Marquez. I am a graduate student at the Latin American Hemispheric Studies program at the Yale School. My question is about foreign policy. How do you think all the issues that you have addressed will affect Brazilians' outreach towards the world up to 2018 and maybe afterwards? Thank you.
Thanks. You have a question? Yeah.
Alex Sanchez, defense analyst. Talking about civil military relations for a moment, General Eduardo Diaz da Costa, commander of the army, gave an interview 2 weeks ago for Valor Económico, in which he said that the country is thrifty, that Brazil es un país que está a la deriva. I was wondering what you think about those statements. It's never good for any government when the commander of your armed forces, the army, begins to undermine you. What do you think about what Temer's relationship with the military is going to be like in the future?
Okay, thanks. Well, good questions. Joel, you wanna take a crack, and then we'll go to Claudia?
Can I answer yes or no?
Yeah. Just give a percentage to each one.
Exactly.
Why don't you give a percentage?
No, these are all good questions. Wow, where to start? The reforms and the contradiction of Temer facing all these problems and having no popularity at all, and still having a very strong coalition in Congress to pass reforms through. I think that the reason for that is interestingly, it's paradoxical, the fact that you have a political class, or the majority of the political class, that part of his coalition, that are essentially acting or behaving instinct of political survival, in the sense that they are being hit hard by the scandals, and they will continue to be hit hard by the investigations, because I'm not saying only personal corruption and embezzlement, but also the fact that the political system is rigged in the sense that you have this dirty money flooding into the system, and 90% of politicians have benefited from it, one way or another. So from a public opinion point of view, politicians will continue to be hit hard for the foreseeable future. The economy is not doing so well. So the instinct of survival that I mentioned is that for them, the only glimpse of hope in terms of keeping a political career post-2018 is to have a relatively successful government. And to have a relatively successful term of government means to pass some of the reforms that will get, turn the corner on the crisis. So bad with Temer, worse without him. So that's kind of so that's a complete sense of political survival that's driving these reforms. Of course, it depends on the degree of faithfulness, of loyalty to Temer. It varies with respect to each reform. But overall, that's what's driving Temer towards success in Congress, not in the streets. And it's interesting as well to highlight that the fact that you have you had corporate donations prohibited in Brazil in the last elections, and so the importance of public resources has increased. So for these guys, they can't, there's no more corporate donations for elections in Brazil, right, for parties. So if you don't have money from corporations, from the private sector, it increases the importance of the state. And Temer has the power of the pen to dole out resources and money. So that explains the reforms. The safety net, I think that it is, you mentioned a good point. I think that it's part of the problem there when it comes to pension reform. I think part of the fiscal problem that Brazil lives today has little to do, or has a little bit to do with, of course, the end of the commodity cycle and with mismanagement of the economy by the previous administration. Yes, but those are not, but there are more structural reasons behind Brazil's imbalance or structural imbalance today, which is one would flag the Constitution, the 1988 Constitution, that is very generous when it comes to entitlements. Some of them need to be reformed. Right? It doesn't mean that essentially, but of course, parallel to that, there's been a very strong safety net of policies that have been put in place that will survive, Bolsa Familia and others. But there will be a significant shift, I think, in terms of the size of the state on that sense. So that's why we think that regardless of who wins, left, right, popularity levels, discontent with the political class will remain. That's for the foreseeable future, I think. What else? Future of construction companies. I do think that overall, this transformative shift. It does mean that Brazil relied a lot on these domestic champions, right? For key sectors, Embraer, air and space, Vale, mining. They wanted, for each sector, they want a national champion. I think there's a cost to that. There's a cost of kind of trying to have a market reserve for your companies, and that cost is the potential for cartel-like operations that you had on the construction sector. So I do think that the end result of this will lead to more will open the opportunity for new players to go with Brazil. Yeah. Of course, there will be problems, but I do think that the economy will rely less on these domestic champions and more on smaller, medium-sized companies as well, which maybe brings along a whole set of new problems, but still. The country's drifting in foreign policy. Well, it's strange that it came from an army commander. If from the Navy commander, I do think that wouldn't be a bad comment. But I do think that the context there is that there are talks about pension reform and the military is out of it, right? They're being excluded, and they do have a very generous pension system there, and and the government is pressuring to tackle that as well. So I would read some behind those comments, there may be some positioning there as well. Let me stop here to let Claudia answer and Peter answer the other questions.
Claudia?
Well, Congress support, I think João is right. And I think there is also a personality thing with Temer and the way he relates to Congress people. Like he is a much more he gives much more attention. He calls the Congress, the members of the House every time they pass something that is important for the government. He receives them in the palace. So it's a totally different dynamic than existed with Dilma. That was lack the ability to have a good relationship with the political class. And in the question of China, yes, China is playing a role. The sector, the only sector that really grew in Brazil last year was the agribusiness sector. There was, Brazil had a record, will have this year a record harvest, and there is a projection that it will increase, I think, by 20%. And of course, China is the main destination for our exports. It's our main market for soybeans, and China is growing in a very significant way its investments in Brazil. Part of the growth in foreign direct investment in January was an operation that China bought the CPFL, the energy company in São Paulo. China has a very strong presence now in the energy sector in Brazil, not only a State Grid, which is the largest Chinese energy company, has a very strong presence in Brazil now. And Chinese companies are investing in banking sector, investing in manufacturing, in oil sector, and there is all the indications that this is a process that will gain momentum if the Brazilian economy recover. And the foreign policy question, I don't think foreign policy will be a topic of the elections. But I think we can say that in the current government, there was a clear shift to a more pragmatic, less ideological foreign policy when you compare to Dilma and especially Dilma period. And there is, the current government is much more open to the discussions of the need for trade deals. There is a strong conviction that trade might be one of the factors that could help the economic growth. The question is that the world does not seem to be as willing or as open to trade deals as it used to be. So it remains to be seen if this new willingness and openness from the Brazil side will lead to concrete trade agreements or more openness on the foreign front.
Great, thank you. Peter?
Just very quickly, I just want to take two. On the safety net, one has to be very, the safety net we generally think of as sort of something to help poor people, people who are vulnerable and disadvantaged. The safety net in Brazil reaches out to the military, Congress. I mean, it's an enormous, in many respects, you could almost say that the Brazilian safety nets serve mostly the people who work for the government. And I think that we'll see, this is the next big battle that Temer has to fight for pension reform, which is just gobbling up huge amounts of government expenditure, something like, I think it's 12% of the gross national product, which makes up 25 to 30% of the national budget goes to pensions. And that's unsustainable, simply unsustainable. And so they have to, and it cuts almost every level and every level of society. And I just don't see how they can sort of keep up. I mean, they're going to have to cut somewhere, and hopefully it will be in the pensions that go to people who retire at 50 years old and then get another job. But this is a really enormous battle, and Lula and the left has sort of declared that this is the point where they're going to resist most strongly. So this is going to be an interesting and may determine the success or failure of the Temer government. On foreign policy, very quickly, I think Brazil has shrunk just enormously on any sort of foreign policy scale at this point. The sort of economic problems, the internal problems, the Odebrecht scandal that went around Latin America have just made Brazil, and my guess is that it's going to take this rebuilding of the economy and government to begin to make Brazil a serious international actor again.
I thought you were going to say make Brazil great again.
Yeah, I almost did. And I just think that so far there's not been the kind of reform that would be necessary to really open up the economy in the sense of getting rid of all the benefits that Brazilian firms now get, the subsidies. And when you have a foreign minister, ex-foreign minister, that says Brazil is the most open country in the world, it doesn't sound good for real changes.
João, what's the Eurasia group? What's the prospect of the pension reforms? What's your drill down on that a little bit? What do you think is? What's your prediction?
No, it's pretty high. If you put a percentage on
Yeah.
percentage that passes,
Yeah.
it's 70%, meaning that, I mean, that does include some dilutions to it, of course. I mean,
Okay.
but the core of the proposal, the main provisions, they do pass. So we do, to a great extent, for that reason, that the logic that plays out, that gives that support. And if you go to less controversial reforms in the microeconomic space, mentioned labor reform, it's controversial as well. We do think that some of those elements there also pass. So that's why underneath the radar, some microeconomic reforms pass. One quick comment on Peter's on Latin America and corruption and foreign policy is that we've known that in Latin America there's been a lot of attempts to integrate, right? I mean, I think Latin America is the region in the world that has the largest number of trade agreements and regional institutions. So too much integration for too little space. And they don't work that well. Right? I mean, if you look with a few exceptions. Now, what I do think that may work is that kind of integration that works is the task force that was established between Brazil and 9 or 10 other countries in the region on the corruption, on trying to between the public prosecutors in Brazil and these other countries. That's the kind of integration that should work. That's the kind of foreign policy that Brazil should proceed, because that's the expertise that we have. It's on dealing with corruption.
Right.
So I think that, even though some say, oh, let's, sweep that under the rug, no. I mean, that's one of the flaws that the country has, and we built mechanisms to deal with it. And I think, despite the ups and downs, overall, and tying to your mention of the Mensalão 10 years ago and to this, I think it's there's been a learning process there, how to deal. There have been some progress in terms of building and strengthening institutions. So I think that could be something that could, the export of Brazil's know-how in dealing with this corruption.
We should thank Odebrecht for having the staggering regional because it's provoked a strong integrative.
Odebrecht himself created a strong integration among corrupt companies in 12 or 15 countries.
Claudia?
Yeah. No, I just wanted to comment on João, on this learning curve of the corruption thing. And I think, and you said that the Lava Jato increased the cost of corruption for politicians. But I think the main factor, it increased the cost of corruption for companies. Yeah. I think that it will be the thing that will change the landscape in the corruption, because companies will be much more reluctant to accept paying bribes to politicians. Like when you see the owners of the largest Brazilian companies in jail, something that we have never seen in history, I think that will lead to profound changes in compliance and internal controls that the companies will adopt. And it will make, even if the politicians are willing to accept bribes, they will have a hard time finding people willing to bribe them. Yeah. Sorry.
Great. Thank you. Thank you all. Claudia, thank you. João, Peter, enjoy the rest of Carnival. 2017 starts when, Wednesday?
Wednesday.
Wednesday,
Wednesday,
okay.
Wednesday.
So
Afternoon.
Afternoon, okay. So you could party all morning, but the afternoon, the year starts seriously. Thank you all so much for coming. Thank you.
It is.